The summer of 1980 clung to Millfield, Ohio like a fever. Heat radiated off the pavement in shimmering waves, and the cicadas droned their relentless symphony from dawn until dusk. In this small coal mining town nestled in the Appalachian foothills, where everyone claimed to know everyone else's business, the Harmon family lived in a modest two-story home on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from the town's main drag. Jack and Elaine Harmon had moved to Millfield in 1975 with their 3 children, 12-year-old Michael, 10-year-old Rebecca, and 7-year-old Timothy. Jack worked as a foreman at the Millfield Coal Company, while Elaine taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. They were well-liked but kept mostly to themselves, an ordinary family living an ordinary life in a town where the extraordinary rarely happened. Until August, the morning began like any other Sunday. The Harmons attended the 9 a.m. service at First Baptist Church, where Reverend Thomas Grayson delivered a sermon on forgiveness that several congregants would later recall with eerie clarity. Elaine, dressed in a yellow sundress, sang in the choir. Jack, wearing his only suit navy blue and slightly too small, sat in the 3rd row with the children. Michael fidgeted throughout the service, earning occasional stern glances from his father. Rebecca sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, while Timothy quietly colored Bible scenes in a book Elaine had given him to keep him occupied. After church, the family drove to Clark's Diner for their traditional Sunday brunch. Waitress Dorothy Clark, the owner's daughter, remembered serving them that day. They were always such a nice family, she would later tell investigators. The kids were so polite, always saying please and thank you. That day, they seemed completely normal. Michael ordered chocolate chip pancakes. Rebecca had scrambled eggs. Little Timmy had his usual Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, with extra syrup. Security camera footage from the diner, grainy and black and white, captured what would be the last public images of Rebecca and Timothy Harmon. In the brief clip, Rebecca can be seen helping Timothy cut his pancakes, leaning over with an expression of sisterly patience. Timothy smiles up at her, a gap where his front tooth should be. Neither child shows any sign of distress or awareness that within hours they would vanish from existence. The Harmons left Clark's Diner at approximately 11:45 a.m. Jack had planned to take the family fishing at Miller's Pond, but an unexpected call from the mine changed their plans. There had been a minor equipment malfunction that required his attention. It wouldn't take long, an hour at most, but it meant postponing their fishing trip. They returned home instead. Jack changed out of his church clothes and headed to the mine, promising to be back by mid-afternoon. Elaine decided to use the time to prepare for the upcoming school year, spreading lesson plans across the dining room table. Michael asked permission to ride his bike to his friend David Wells' house 3 streets over. With Jack gone and Elaine absorbed in her work, Rebecca and Timothy were told to play in the fenced backyard until their father returned. It was the last time Elaine would see her 2 youngest children. At 2:37 p.m., Jack called home to let Elaine know he'd be another hour. Phone records confirmed the 3-minute call. Elaine would later tell police that during the call, she glanced out the dining room window to check on the children. She saw Rebecca pushing Timothy on the tire swing that hung from the large oak tree. Everything seemed fine. At 3:15 p.m., Elaine finished organizing her lesson plans and went to the back door to call the children in for a snack. The backyard was empty. The tire swing swayed gently in the August breeze. Rebecca's jump rope lay abandoned near the sandbox. Timothy's favorite toy truck was overturned beside the swing set, but there was no sign of the children. Elaine wasn't immediately concerned. The backyard gate opened onto an alley that led to a small neighborhood park. She assumed they had gone there, though they knew they weren't supposed to leave the yard without permission. She walked to the park, expecting to find them on the slides or swings with other neighborhood children. The park was deserted in the afternoon heat. Returning home, Elaine began calling neighbors. Had anyone seen Rebecca and Timothy? No one had. By 4:30 p.m., when Jack returned home, Elaine's concern had escalated to panic. Jack immediately organized the neighbors into search parties while Elaine called the police. Officer Ray Milner was the first to respond to the call. His initial report classified the case as a possible runaway situation, despite Elaine's insistence that her children would never leave voluntarily. It wasn't unusual for children to wander off, Milner noted, and they typically returned home by dinner time. But dinner time came and went. As darkness fell over Millfield, more police officers joined the search, along with dozens of volunteers from the community. They combed the neighborhood, calling out the children's names, their voices echoing through the warm summer night. By midnight, when there was still no sign of Rebecca and Timothy, the case was reclassified as a possible abduction. The next morning, August 18, brought the state police, and by afternoon, the FBI. Special Agent Thomas Conley took charge of the investigation. His first action was to establish a comprehensive timeline of the children's last known movements. The window of disappearance is approximately 1 hour, Conley told the assembled team of investigators. Between 2:37 p.m., when Mrs. Harmon visually confirmed the children were in the backyard, and 3:15 p.m. when she discovered them missing. That's our focus. The backyard yielded few clues. There were no signs of struggle, no blood evidence, no footprints other than those belonging to the family. The only entry point was the wooden gate that opened onto the alley, which had a simple latch that even Timothy could operate. The gate had been found unlatched but closed. Investigators discovered what appeared to be tire tracks in the unpaved alley behind the house, but recent rains made it impossible to determine when they were made or what type of vehicle might have left them. The investigators' attention quickly turned to the family. In cases of missing children, family members are always the first suspects. Jack and Elaine Harmon were questioned separately for hours. Their son Michael, who had returned home just as the police were arriving, was interviewed by a child psychologist. All three passed polygraph tests, and their alibis checked out. Jack had been at the mine with dozens of witnesses. Elaine had been in the house, and phone records confirmed her call with Jack at 2:37 p.m. Michael had been at the Wells house all afternoon, confirmed by both David Wells and his mother. The Harmons, it seemed, were a family in genuine crisis, not perpetrators of some elaborate deception. As the investigation expanded, agents canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing everyone within a 10-block radius. Had anyone seen anything unusual that Sunday afternoon? Had any strangers been spotted in the area? Had anyone heard screams or the sound of a vehicle stopping suddenly? One neighbor, elderly widow Margaret Thompson, who lived directly across the alley from the Harmons, reported seeing a blue van drive slowly through the alley around 3:00 p.m. She couldn't recall the make or model, only that it was dusty-looking and had no windows on its sides. She hadn't seen the driver or noticed if it had stopped anywhere. Another neighbor, 16-year-old Peter Crawley, who had been washing his father's car in their driveway 2 houses down from the Harmons, remembered hearing a dog barking frantically around the same time. He hadn't thought much of it. Dogs were always barking in the neighborhood, but in retrospect he realized it had been the Harmons' German Shepherd Max. The dog had been found inside the house during the initial search, unharmed but agitated. These fragments of information were intriguing but far from conclusive. A blue van, a barking dog. None of it explained how 2 children could vanish from a fenced backyard in broad daylight in a quiet neighborhood, where strangers were immediately noticed and commented upon. As days stretched into weeks, the investigation expanded to include known sex offenders in a 50-mile radius, recent parolees with histories of violence against children, and transients who might have been passing through the area. Dozens were interviewed, none became serious suspects. Meanwhile, the Harmon family's lives unraveled. Jack took a leave of absence from the mine to participate in the search. Elaine was plagued by guilt for not checking on the children more frequently. Michael withdrew into himself, speaking little and sleeping less. The media descended on Millfield, turning the small town into a circus of news vans, reporters and curiosity seekers. The case captured national attention. Rebecca and Timothy's school photos appeared on the evening news, in newspapers, and on flyers posted in store windows across the country. Their faces, Rebecca with her serious expression and neatly braided hair, Timothy with his gap-toothed smile and cowlick, became symbols of every parent's worst nightmare. 30 days after the disappearance, the FBI established a dedicated tip line. It rang constantly. Callers reported seeing the children in shopping malls in Texas, at rest stops in Florida, at amusement parks in California. Every lead was investigated. Every tip led nowhere. In October, as the leaves turned gold and crimson in the Ohio woods, a potential break came in the case. A man named Harold Jenkins was arrested for attempting to lure a young girl into his car outside a school in Portsmouth, 40 miles from Millfield. Jenkins drove a blue Chevrolet van with no windows on the sides. He had a prior conviction for indecent exposure and had been in the Millfield area in August, visiting his sister. For a moment it seemed the case might be solved. Jenkins was interrogated for 3 days straight. His van was thoroughly processed for evidence. His sister's home was searched, but no physical evidence connected him to Rebecca and Timothy's disappearance. Jenkins, while clearly a predator, had a solid alibi for August 17. He had been in church with his sister's family, then at a family barbecue with more than a dozen witnesses. The blue van lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated. As winter settled over Millfield, the investigation grew colder than the snow that blanketed the Harmons' empty backyard. The FBI scaled back its presence. The media moved on to other stories. The volunteers who had once numbered in the hundreds dwindled to a handful of dedicated friends and family members. But the Harmons refused to give up. Jack and Elaine appeared on national television, pleading for information. They established a reward fund that grew to $50,000. They consulted psychics, despite the FBI's gentle discouragement. They kept their porch light burning 24 hours a day, so their children could find their way home. Christmas of 1980 was a somber affair in the Harmon household. Elaine hung stockings for Rebecca and Timothy. She wrapped presents that would never be opened. Jack sat for hours in the backyard, staring at the tire swing, now still and silent. Michael barely spoke at all. The one-year anniversary of the disappearance brought a renewed flurry of media interest. The case was featured on a popular crime-solving television program. New tips came in, but none led anywhere substantive. By then, statistical probability suggested a grim outcome. Children missing for more than a year are rarely found alive. But without bodies, without proof of harm, the case remained officially classified as a disappearance, not a homicide. In 1982, Jack and Elaine Harmon divorced, a common outcome for parents of missing children. The strain had simply been too much. Jack moved to Cincinnati but returned to Millfield every month to meet with local police and check on any developments in the case. Elaine remained in the house on Maple Street, unable to leave the last place her children had been seen. Michael graduated high school and left for college in California, as far from Ohio as he could get. He rarely returned. In 1985, 5 years after the disappearance, the Millfield Police Department officially classified the case as cold. The file, by then thousands of pages thick, was archived. Special Agent Conley, who had never stopped working the case in his spare time, retired from the FBI. He sent Christmas cards to Elaine every year, always with the same message: still looking, never giving up. Life in Millfield slowly returned to normal, though the town would never be quite the same. Parents no longer let their children play unsupervised. The community's sense of safety had been permanently shattered. The Harmon case became local legend, a cautionary tale told to new residents, and a wound that never fully healed for those who had lived through it. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, there were occasional resurgences of interest in the case. In 1989, a convicted child killer named Raymond Cooper, dying of liver cancer in an Illinois prison, claimed responsibility for abducting and murdering 2 children from Ohio sometime in the early 80s. Investigators rushed to interview him, but Cooper died before providing any details that could verify his confession. Most believed it had been a false claim, a not uncommon occurrence among notorious criminals seeking a final moment of infamy. In 1994, a woman in Seattle contacted the FBI, claiming she had been Rebecca Harmon's childhood friend and had repressed memories of seeing a man take the children from the backyard. After extensive interviews, her account was deemed unreliable. She had never lived in Millfield and had apparently constructed the narrative after reading about the case in a true crime magazine. By the turn of the millennium, the Harmon case had become a footnote in the history of American crime. Occasionally, it would be mentioned in articles or books about unsolved disappearances, usually as an example of a perfect crime, one that left no evidence, no witnesses, and no resolution. Elaine Harmon died in 2010 from breast cancer, still living in the house on Maple Street, still keeping the porch light on. In her final days, she told the hospice nurse that she was looking forward to seeing her children again. "They have been waiting for me," she said. "They have been waiting for so long." Jack Harmon, who had remarried and had another child, continued to visit Millfield once a year. On the anniversary of the disappearance, he would place flowers at the base of the oak tree where the tire swing had once hung, though the tree itself had been cut down years earlier after being struck by lightning. He died in 2017 of a heart attack, having never learned what happened to Rebecca and Timothy. Michael Harmon built a life in California, becoming a software engineer and founding a successful tech company. He married but never had children. In rare interviews about his life, he avoided discussing his siblings' disappearance. Those close to him understood it was a closed subject. The trauma of that August day had shaped his life in ways both visible and invisible. And so the case remained a mystery without resolution, a wound without healing, a story without an ending. Until March 15, 2024, when a construction crew began demolishing an abandoned property on the outskirts of Millfield, a former auto repair shop that had been closed since as an excavator tore through the building's concrete floor. The operator noticed something unusual, a section of the floor that sounded hollow when struck. Beneath a carefully concealed trapdoor, the crew discovered a small cellar that didn't appear on any building plans. And in that cellar, pushed against the far wall, was a large metal trunk, its once blue surface now almost entirely consumed by rust. The construction foreman, sensing something ominous, called the police before allowing anyone to open it. When Detective Laura Emerson arrived at the scene, she approached the trunk with a sense of dread that she would later describe as almost supernatural, like the air itself was heavy with decades of secrets. Using crowbars and bolt cutters to break through the rusted lock, Emerson and her team carefully opened the trunk, revealing contents that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and would soon reverberate across the entire country. Inside the trunk were children's clothing, a girl's hair ribbon, a small toy truck, and human remains. After 44 years, Rebecca and Timothy Harmon had finally been found. But the discovery of their remains was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new and equally disturbing chapter in the investigation. For the trunk contained not only the remains of the Harmon children, but also evidence that would lead investigators down a path darker and more twisted than anyone in Millfield could have imagined. The question was no longer just who had taken Rebecca and Timothy Harmon from their backyard on that summer day in 1980. Now investigators faced a more complex puzzle. Why had they been taken? What had happened to them in their final moments? And perhaps most disturbing of all, had the person responsible been hiding in plain sight all along, walking the streets of Millfield for the past 44 years? As Detective Emerson stood over the rusted trunk in the hidden cellar, the first pieces of a decades-old puzzle finally began to fall into place. But the picture they formed was more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. A dark tapestry of secrets, lies, and betrayals that would challenge everything the people of Millfield thought they knew about their town and about themselves. The truth, buried for nearly half a century, was about to come to light, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The discovery of the rusted trunk sent shockwaves through Millfield. Within hours of Detective Laura Emerson's initial call to headquarters, the abandoned auto repair shop had been transformed into a full-scale crime scene. Yellow police tape encircled the property. Mobile forensic labs hummed with activity. State police and FBI agents, some not even born when Rebecca and Timothy Harmon disappeared, converged on the site, drawn by a case that had become legendary in law enforcement circles. Dr. Eleanor Foster, the county's medical examiner for over 20 years, arrived as the spring sun began to set. At 63, she had thought herself beyond shock, but the contents of the trunk left even her hardened sensibilities shaken. Working with meticulous care, she supervised the removal of the remains to her facility, where the painstaking work of identification and determining cause of death would begin. "Treat them gently," she instructed the forensic technicians, as they carefully transferred the small bones into specialized containers. "They have waited a long time to tell their story." The clothing found in the trunk, a girl's sundress with a faded floral pattern and a boy's red t-shirt and denim shorts, matched the descriptions of what Rebecca and Timothy had been wearing on the day they vanished. The toy truck was immediately recognizable as the one Timothy had been playing with in the backyard. A pink hair ribbon, still tied in a perfect bow, was consistent with the one visible in Rebecca's last school photograph. But it was a smaller item, easily overlooked among the more obvious evidence that would prove most significant. A tarnished silver charm bracelet with a single charm, a miniature book that opened to reveal the engraved words, "To Becky, Christmas 1979. Love." Jack Harmon had given the bracelet to his daughter 8 months before her disappearance. In police photographs from 1980, Rebecca could be seen wearing it at church on the morning she vanished. As word of the discovery spread through Millfield, residents who had lived with the mystery for decades gathered near the crime scene, holding candles despite the early spring chill. Many wept openly. For this small community, the finding represented both closure and reopened wounds, answers to long-held questions, and the confirmation of long-feared truths. Michael Harmon, now 56 and living in San Francisco, received the call from Detective Emerson at 11:42 p.m. Eastern Time. After decades of imagining this moment, the reality left him numb. He booked the first available flight to Ohio, arriving the following afternoon. Walking into the Millfield Police Department, he was struck by how little had changed since his childhood. The same wood-paneled walls, the same fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in a sickly glow. Only the faces were different. "We will find who did this," Emerson promised him in the small conference room where they met. She was 42, with prematurely silver hair and the focused intensity of someone who had dedicated her life to speaking for the voiceless. "Technology has come a long way since evidence that couldn't be processed then can tell us volumes now." Michael nodded, but said little. He had learned long ago that promises were easily made and rarely kept. 4 decades had taught him that justice, like closure, often remained elusive. Still, he provided a DNA sample for comparison testing, though there was little doubt about the identities of the remains. He also agreed to be interviewed about the events of August 17, 1980, hoping his adult perspective might reveal details his 12-year-old self had missed. Meanwhile, the forensic investigation accelerated. The trunk itself yielded crucial evidence. Manufactured between 1975 and 1978, it was a common storage item sold at department stores throughout the Midwest. This particular model had a distinctive latch mechanism that had been recalled in 1979 due to a tendency to lock accidentally, trapping children who might climb inside during play. The recall was a tenuous lead at best. Thousands of such trunks had been sold, but it was meticulously documented in the case file. More telling was the soil analysis from the cellar floor. The concrete had been poured in 2 distinct phases. The original foundation dated to the building's construction in 1962. But the section concealing the hidden cellar had been added later in August or September of 1980, according to chemical dating methods. The timing was damning. Someone had created a hiding place specifically to conceal evidence related to the Harmon children's disappearance. The auto repair shop itself provided another critical piece of the puzzle. County records showed it had been owned by a man named Vernon Blackwell from 1965 until his death in 1992, after which the property had fallen into disrepair and eventually tax foreclosure. The name meant nothing to the current investigators, but a search of the original case files revealed that Blackwell had been interviewed briefly in 1980 as part of the neighborhood canvass. He had claimed to be out of town visiting relatives in Kentucky when the children disappeared, an alibi that had been verified through hotel receipts and family member statements. Yet something about Blackwell nagged at Detective Emerson. His interview had been cursory, less than 30 minutes, according to the file notes. Standard procedure, perhaps, for someone with a verified alibi, but still unsatisfying given what they now knew about where the children's remains had been hidden. A deeper background check on Blackwell revealed troubling inconsistencies. While he had no criminal record as an adult, juvenile court records from Louisville, Kentucky showed he had been arrested at 16 for breaking into a neighbor's home and stealing women's undergarments. The charges had been dismissed after psychological evaluation and counseling. The incident wouldn't have appeared in the 1980 background checks, which focused primarily on adult criminal history, especially in out-of-state jurisdictions. More disturbingly, Blackwell's employment history showed he had worked as a janitor at Millfield Elementary School from 1972 to 1974, where Elaine Harmon later taught and where Rebecca had been a student. He had left the position after complaints about inappropriate comments made to female students, though no formal charges had ever been filed. He had opened the auto repair shop the following year. As these details emerged, Emerson couldn't help but feel they were getting closer to the truth. But Blackwell had been dead for 32 years. If he was responsible, any confession or explanation had died with him, and without more direct evidence linking him to the crime, the case against him remained circumstantial at best. The medical examiner's findings, released a week after the discovery, provided both answers and new questions. DNA testing confirmed what the personal effects had already suggested. The remains were indeed those of Rebecca and Timothy Harmon. Both children had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck from behind with a heavy object. The injuries were severe enough to have been fatal, but Dr. Foster's report contained an unexpected detail. Based on insect activity and decomposition patterns, she estimated that the children had died within hours of their disappearance, but their bodies had not been placed in the trunk immediately. Instead, they appeared to have been kept somewhere else, possibly refrigerated, or in another cool environment for approximately 1 week before being sealed in the trunk and hidden in the cellar. This revelation transformed the understanding of the crime. The abduction was not a spontaneous act, but something carefully planned, with provisions made for concealing the victims afterwards. It suggested a level of premeditation that pointed to someone intimately familiar with the family's routines, someone who knew when the children would be alone and vulnerable in the backyard. And there was one more detail that Dr. Foster found particularly troubling. Slight damage to Timothy's finger bones suggested his hands had been bound, but no restraint marks were visible on Rebecca's remains. The implication was clear but horrifying. While Timothy had been restrained, Rebecca might have stayed voluntarily, perhaps to protect her younger brother, or because she knew and trusted their abductor. As the forensic evidence accumulated, Detective Emerson and her team began re-interviewing anyone still living who had been connected to the original investigation. Most were elderly now, their memories clouded by time, but certain details remained sharp, preserved by the trauma of that August day and its aftermath. Margaret Thompson, the neighbor who had reported seeing a blue van in the alley, had died but her daughter, now in her 60s, remembered her mother mentioning something she hadn't told the police in 1980. The van had parked briefly behind a house 2 doors down from the Harmons, not directly behind their property. The house had belonged to the Wilson family, whose son Thomas had been a senior in high school that year. Thomas Wilson was now a 58-year-old accountant living in Columbus. When contacted by investigators, he expressed shock at the discovery of the remains, but insisted he knew nothing about the disappearance. He had been working at the local grocery store on the day the children vanished, a fact verified by employment records and the statements of his former manager. His connection to the case seemed tangential at best, until Emerson discovered a yearbook photograph showing Wilson and Michael Harmon together on the middle school basketball team. They had known each other, albeit casually. Another former neighbor, Peter Crawley, who had reported hearing the Harmons' dog barking, was now a real estate developer in Chicago. In a phone interview, he mentioned something that hadn't seemed significant in 1980, but struck him as odd in retrospect. The dog had stopped barking quite suddenly, as if someone familiar had calmed it. The Harmons' German Shepherd Max had been known in the neighborhood for his protective nature and wariness of strangers. These fragments of van parked 2 doors down, a dog that ceased barking at a familiar presence, began to suggest a troubling possibility. The person who took Rebecca and Timothy might not have been a stranger at all, but someone they knew, someone from the community, someone who had maintained the appearance of normalcy while harboring unthinkable secrets. The investigation's focus expanded to include not just Vernon Blackwell, but anyone connected to both the Harmon family and the auto repair shop. Employer records from the shop were sparse, but they did reveal that Blackwell had employed 3 mechanics during the summer of 2 were deceased, but the third, a man named Gerald Fisher, was living in a nursing home in Cincinnati. At 82, Fisher was frail and suffering from early-stage dementia, but he remembered working for Blackwell clearly. Yes, he recalled the Harmon case everyone in Millfield did. No, he had never suspected Blackwell of involvement. But there was something he remembered from late August 1980, something that had struck him as strange but not necessarily sinister at the time. Vernon closed the shop for a week, Fisher told Emerson during their interview at the nursing home. Said he had to install a new hydraulic lift, but when I came back, nothing had changed. The floor looked the same as always. I asked him about it, and he got real mad, told me to mind my own business. The timing aligned perfectly with Dr. Foster's estimation of when the bodies would have been placed in the trunk and concealed in the cellar. But while the circumstantial evidence against Blackwell continued to mount, a direct connection to the abduction itself remained elusive. That changed when FBI forensic technicians, using advanced DNA extraction methods, recovered partial genetic material from the inside of the trunk's latch. The sample was degraded after 44 years, but modern analysis techniques made it possible to develop a partial profile. It wasn't complete enough for a standard database match, but it could be compared to known samples for inclusion or exclusion. When measured against Vernon Blackwell's genetic profile, obtained from medical records preserved by his former doctor, the results were inconclusive. The partial DNA neither confirmed nor eliminated him as the person who had handled the trunk. The investigation had reached a frustrating impasse. Then, 3 weeks after the discovery of the remains, a 76-year-old woman named Judith Reynolds walked into the Millfield Police Department. She had been following news of the case and had decided, after much soul-searching, that she could no longer keep her silence. In 1980, Reynolds had been a 32-year-old nurse at Millfield Memorial Hospital. On the night of August 17, the day Rebecca and Timothy disappeared, she had been working the emergency room when Vernon Blackwell came in with an injury to his forearm. He had claimed it was a workshop accident, a deep cut from a slipped wrench. Reynolds remembered it clearly because of Blackwell's nervous behavior and because the wound didn't look like a typical mechanical injury. It had the distinctive pattern of a human bite. I asked him if someone had bitten him. Reynolds told Detective Emerson. He got real defensive, said I didn't know what I was talking about. I cleaned and stitched the wound, but I remember thinking something wasn't right. Then the news about those poor children came out the next day, and I wondered, but I didn't have any proof. Just a feeling, and you can't accuse someone based on a feeling. Reynolds' statement was a breakthrough, a contemporaneous injury consistent with defensive wounds inflicted by a child on the very day of the disappearance, from a man whose property would later yield the victim's remains. It was the most compelling evidence yet against Vernon Blackwell. Medical records confirmed Reynolds' account of treating Blackwell that night, though the nature of the injury was described only as a laceration requiring sutures. With this new information, investigators obtained a warrant to search the house where Blackwell had lived until his death, now occupied by a young family who had purchased it in. The current owners were horrified to learn of their home's potential connection to such a notorious crime, but cooperated fully with the investigation. In the detached garage behind the house, forensic technicians discovered a hidden compartment beneath the workbench, accessible only by removing several carefully placed storage bins and a false panel. Inside was a small metal box containing photographs, dozens of them, showing children around Millfield throughout the 1970s. Most had been taken from a distance in parks or outside schools. None were explicitly sexual, but the secretive nature of the collection and the focus on children was deeply disturbing. 5 of the photographs showed Rebecca Harmon walking home from school or playing in the front yard. 3 showed Timothy at the community pool. The most recent, dated July 1980, in Blackwell's handwriting on the back, captured both children in their backyard, unaware they were being photographed. The image had been taken from the alley behind their house. For Detective Emerson and her team, the photographs transformed the case from circumstantial to compelling. Vernon Blackwell had been stalking the Harmon children for months before their disappearance. Combined with the hidden cellar, the suspicious timing of the shop's closure, the bite wound on the day of the abduction, and his history of inappropriate behavior toward children, the evidence painted a damning picture. But if Blackwell was responsible, why hadn't the original investigation identified him as a suspect? How had he maintained his cover so effectively? And most puzzling of all, how had he abducted 2 children from a fenced backyard in broad daylight, without anyone seeing or hearing anything unusual? The answer emerged from an unexpected source. During his interview with Detective Emerson, Michael Harmon had mentioned something he hadn't thought about in decades. His father had taken the family car to the mine that Sunday, leaving his mother's station wagon in the driveway. But when Michael returned home around 4:30 p.m., he remembered seeing his mother's car parked on the street instead, about half a block away. At the time, with the chaos of the disappearance unfolding, no one had questioned the car's position. Elaine had likely moved it during her frantic search for the children, or so everyone assumed, but revisiting this detail through the lens of the new evidence suggested a more sinister possibility. Checking the original police photographs from August 17, 1980, Emerson confirmed that Elaine's 1978 Ford Country Squire station wagon was indeed parked on the street rather than in the driveway. When she asked the retired officer who had taken the photos about this detail, he recalled something odd. The keys to the station wagon had been found in the ignition, which Elaine insisted was not where she had left them. The implications were staggering. Had someone taken Elaine's car that afternoon? Could Blackwell have used it to abduct the children, knowing they would willingly enter a familiar vehicle? It would explain how he had managed to take them without causing a disturbance. No strange van, no struggle, just their mother's car driven by someone they perhaps recognized from around town. Motor vehicle records showed that in 1980, Vernon Blackwell had driven a blue 1973 Chevrolet van, matching the description given by Margaret Thompson. But as a mechanic, he would have had the skills to hot-wire a car or duplicate keys from a brief examination of the original. And as the owner of an auto repair shop, he would have had opportunities to access the Harmon's vehicles during routine maintenance. The theory gained further support when investigators discovered that Elaine Harmon had brought her station wagon to Blackwell's shop for brake repairs in June 1980, just 2 months before the disappearance. The work order, preserved in a box of financial records Michael had kept after his mother's death, showed Blackwell himself had handled the repairs. Each new piece of evidence strengthened the case against Vernon Blackwell, creating a narrative that explained not just how the children had died, but how their bodies had come to be hidden beneath his shop. He had stalked them, planned the abduction carefully, used their mother's car to avoid suspicion, killed them when they resisted or when Timothy's bite prompted rage, then concealed their bodies in the shop's hidden cellar after keeping them elsewhere until he could prepare the hiding place. Yet despite the mounting evidence, a shadow of doubt remained. Something about the case still felt incomplete to Detective Emerson, a sensation she had learned to trust over her 20 years in law enforcement. The evidence pointed clearly to Blackwell, but certain aspects of the crime, particularly the fact that Rebecca showed no signs of restraint, while Timothy did, suggested complexities that the current theory didn't fully address. Following her instincts, Emerson decided to re-examine the relationships between all the key players in the case, looking for connections that might have been overlooked. She created a comprehensive timeline of everyone's movements on August 17, 1980, based on the original witness statements and the new evidence that had emerged. The result was illuminating. There was a 2-hour window between when Blackwell was seen at his shop by a customer around 1:00 p.m. and when he appeared at the hospital with the bite wound around 7. During that time, his whereabouts were unaccounted for except for the crucial period between 2:37 p.m. and 3:15 p.m., when Rebecca and Timothy had vanished. But there was someone else whose movements during that exact time frame had never been fully verified: Michael Harmon. The original investigation had accepted that Michael was at his friend David Wells' house all afternoon, based on statements from both boys and David's mother. But reviewing the old interview transcripts, Emerson noticed a discrepancy. David had said they were playing video games in his basement from after lunch until dinner time. His mother had confirmed seeing Michael arrive around 1:30 or 2:00 and leave sometime after 4:00, but admitted she had been doing laundry and gardening throughout the afternoon and hadn't checked on the boys continuously. There was no specific confirmation that Michael had been at the Wells house during the critical window of 2:37 p.m. to 3:15 p.m., when his siblings disappeared. This wasn't evidence of wrongdoing, merely an observation that Michael's alibi, which had seemed solid in 1980, actually contained a potential gap. Under normal circumstances, such a minor discrepancy would hardly be worth noting. But in the context of the mysterious circumstances surrounding Rebecca and Timothy's disappearance, it took on new significance, especially when combined with another detail that had recently emerged. Among the items found in the trunk with the children's remains was a small brass keychain with the initials M engraved on it, matching a gift Michael had received for his 12th birthday, 3 months before the disappearance. When confronted with this information, Michael appeared genuinely shocked. He confirmed the keychain had been his, but said he had lost it earlier that summer, while swimming at Miller's Pond. He had no explanation for how it could have ended up in the trunk with his siblings' remains. The discovery of the keychain introduced a troubling new dimension to the case. Either Michael had lost the keychain and Blackwell had somehow acquired it, using it to frame the boy, or as a trophy, or Michael knew more about his siblings' fate than he had ever revealed. Seeking clarity, Emerson arranged for a more in-depth interview with David Wells, now a college professor living in Seattle. His recollection of that day had faded over 44 years, but he was certain of one thing. He and Michael had been together that afternoon, playing the newly released Space Invaders game his parents had bought him. However, he did recall Michael leaving briefly, perhaps for 30 minutes, saying he needed to check whether his father had returned from the mine so they could go fishing as planned. This revelation placed Michael near his home during the exact window when Rebecca and Timothy had disappeared. Confronted with this information, Michael's composed demeanor began to crack. Yes, he admitted, he had left David's house briefly that afternoon, but only for a few minutes. He had gone home, checked the driveway for his father's car, and seeing it wasn't there, had immediately returned to David's house. He hadn't mentioned this detail in 1980, because it had seemed irrelevant. He hadn't seen anything unusual during his brief visit home. But cell phone records from 2024 revealed something curious. Immediately after his initial interview with Detective Emerson, Michael had placed a 16-minute call to a number in Cincinnati. The number belonged to Diane Blackwell, Vernon Blackwell's daughter and sole surviving relative. When questioned about this call, Michael claimed he had never spoken to Diane Blackwell in his life. The call, he insisted, must be a mistake in the records. But when Emerson contacted Diane, she confirmed that Michael had called her, asking questions about her father and whether he had ever mentioned the Harmon case before his death. He seemed desperate to know what my father might have said about those missing children, Diane told investigators. I told him Dad never talked about it, at least not to me. The whole conversation felt strange, like he was fishing for something specific. As these contradictions in Michael's statements accumulated, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Forensic technicians re-examined the DNA sample from the trunk latch, this time comparing it to Michael's DNA, which he had provided for identifying his siblings' remains. The results showed a potential familial match not conclusive, given the degraded state of the sample, but significant enough to warrant further investigation. Meanwhile, a search of Michael's hotel room in Millfield yielded a disturbing discovery. A newspaper clipping about Vernon Blackwell's auto repair shop from 1980, with the address circled in red ink. Michael had no explanation for this, claiming he had never heard of Blackwell or his shop prior to the recent discovery of his siblings' remains. The evidence, while still circumstantial, pointed to a shocking possibility that Michael Harmon, 12 years old in 1980, might have been involved in or had knowledge of his siblings' disappearance, and that he had maintained this secret for 44 years. But why would a 12-year-old boy harm his younger siblings? And how could he have concealed their bodies in Blackwell's shop without the man's knowledge or assistance? The logistics seemed implausible, the motive incomprehensible. Unless Michael and Blackwell had somehow been connected, their actions intertwined in ways that the original investigation had never suspected, and that the current one was only beginning to uncover. As Detective Emerson prepared to confront Michael with the accumulating evidence against him, a maintenance worker at the hotel where he was staying made a grim discovery. Entering his room after receiving no response to knocks, the worker found Michael Harmon unconscious on the bathroom floor, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the counter and a handwritten note beside it. The note contained only 5 words. "I'm sorry. I had no choice." Emergency responders rushed Michael to Millfield Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Vernon Blackwell had sought treatment for a bite wound 44 years earlier. But his condition remained critical, his survival uncertain. And as he fought for his life in the intensive care unit, the investigation into his siblings' deaths took yet another unexpected turn. For the hospital stay prompted a routine background check that revealed something no one had known. In 1979, a year before Rebecca and Timothy's disappearance, 11-year-old Michael Harmon had been briefly admitted to a psychiatric facility in Cincinnati after exhibiting what his doctors described as disturbing behavior toward younger children and persistent fantasies of violence. The record had been sealed due to his juvenile status and was not discovered during the original investigation. His parents, perhaps out of shame or denial, had never disclosed this information to the authorities. Whether it represented a genuine threat or merely the growing pains of a troubled adolescent was impossible to determine from the sparse documentation that remained. But this revelation, combined with the physical evidence linking Michael to the trunk and his apparent suicide attempt following Emerson's questioning, cast the entire case in a new and disturbing light, one that threatened to overturn 44 years of assumptions about what had happened to Rebecca and Timothy Harmon on that summer day in. As Michael Harmon lay unconscious, suspended between life and death, the truth about his siblings' fate hung similarly in the balance. Had he been a victim forced to carry the terrible secret of their deaths for nearly half a century, or had he been something else entirely, not the grieving brother left behind? but the architect of a tragedy that had haunted Millfield for generations. The answer would emerge in the final hours of Detective Emerson's investigation, revealed through evidence so shocking it would redefine everything the community thought it knew about the case. But that evidence wouldn't come from Michael Harmon or Vernon Blackwell, both now silenced, one by death and the other hovering at its threshold. Instead, it would come from a source no one had considered, a perspective that had been overlooked in both the original investigation and the current one. And when it did, the truth would prove far more complex and far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. In the hushed corridors of Millfield Memorial Hospital, the rhythmic beeping of life support machines measured out the hours as Michael Harmon clung to existence. The overdose had pushed his system to the brink, leaving him in a coma that doctors warned might be permanent. Detective Laura Emerson maintained a vigil outside his room, torn between hope that he would regain consciousness and reveal the truth, and the growing fear that he would take his secrets to the grave. Meanwhile, the investigation continued with renewed urgency. Michael's apparent suicide attempt and cryptic note had transformed the case, suggesting a burden of knowledge or guilt so unbearable that death seemed preferable to its continued weight. But what exactly that burden entailed remained unclear. The psychiatric records from Michael's childhood, while troubling, were too vague to provide concrete insights. His brief stay at the Cincinnati facility had been documented in clinical language that obscured as much as it revealed. Patient exhibits concerning ideation regarding younger siblings and expresses feelings of replacement and displacement within family unit. The attending physician had recommended ongoing therapy, but there was no evidence the Harmons had followed through with this advice after Michael's release. Dr. Francis Winters, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case, reviewed the fragmentary records with a practiced eye. What we are seeing here is consistent with sibling rivalry, possibly intensified by underlying conditions that weren't well understood in the late 1970s, she explained to Detective Emerson. But it's important to note that childhood behavior issues, even serious ones, rarely escalate to homicide. If Michael was involved in his siblings' deaths, something catastrophic must have occurred, a trigger event that pushed him beyond normal boundaries. The search for this potential trigger led investigators back to the Harmon family dynamics in the months preceding the disappearance. Interviews with former neighbors and family friends revealed subtleties that hadn't seemed significant in 1980, but took on new meaning in light of recent developments. Carol Bennett, who had taught piano to all three Harmon children, remembered tensions she had observed during Michael's lessons in the spring of 1980. He was talented but frustrated easily, she recalled during a phone interview from her retirement home in Florida. One day he arrived extremely upset because his parents had missed his school band concert to attend Rebecca's dance recital instead. He kept saying, "It's always about them." I didn't think much of it at the time, normal sibling stuff, you know. But looking back, there was an intensity to his anger that wasn't typical. Another neighbor, who had lived across the street from the Harmons, mentioned overhearing an argument between Jack and Elaine Harmon, approximately 2 weeks before the disappearance. The dispute had concerned Michael's behavior toward his siblings. Jack was saying they needed to be stricter with him, that his jealousy was getting out of hand, the neighbor reported. Elaine defended Michael, said he was just going through a phase. I remember because it was unusual to hear them argue. They were such a private couple. These glimpses into the family's private struggles suggested that Michael's relationship with his siblings had been more troubled than the original investigation had uncovered. But they still didn't explain how a 12-year-old boy could have orchestrated their disappearance and concealed their bodies. Nor did they clarify his connection to Vernon Blackwell. The answer began to emerge from a thorough examination of Blackwell's personal effects, preserved by his daughter Diane, in boxes stored in her attic. Among faded photographs and business records was a leather-bound journal spanning the years. Most entries were mundane notes about car repairs, complaints about suppliers, occasional reflections on local events. But scattered throughout were cryptic references to a person identified only as "men came by today, full of that same old anger. I told him I understand. Nobody else does, but I do. Help him with his problem? The kid's got potential if he can control his impulses. Reminds me of myself at that age. Many is in over his head. Wants my help again. Don't like it, but what choice do I have? Can't let him go down alone. The entries became more frequent in July and early August 1980, culminating in a final entry dated August 18, the day after Rebecca and Timothy disappeared. It's done. Had to clean up Emma's mess. Too late to back out now. God help us both. The journal provided the first tangible evidence of a relationship between Blackwell and someone who could plausibly be Michael Harmon. But the nature of that relationship and how it connected to the disappearance remained obscure. Then, 3 days after Michael's suicide attempt, as he remained unconscious in the hospital, a critical breakthrough occurred. One of the cold case investigators, reviewing employment records from Millfield Coal Company where Jack Harmon had worked, discovered that Vernon Blackwell had been contracted to maintain the company's fleet of vehicles from This placed him in regular contact with Jack Harmon, creating a potential bridge between Blackwell and the Harmon family. Furthermore, payroll records showed that during the summer of 1980, the mine had employed local teenagers for a community outreach program. Among the names on the list was Michael Harmon, who had worked Saturdays washing and detailing the vehicles at the same garage where Blackwell performed maintenance. This connection explained how Michael and Blackwell could have known each other outside the family's occasional visits to the auto repair shop. It provided opportunity for a relationship to develop, for conversations to occur away from parental supervision, for a troubled boy to find an adult who understood him in ways his parents didn't. But the most revealing discovery came from the least expected source. While searching through digitized archives of the Millfield Daily Chronicle for coverage of the original disappearance, investigators found a seemingly unrelated article from July. It concerned a break-in at the elementary school where Elaine Harmon taught an incident that had occurred 3 weeks before Rebecca and Timothy vanished. Nothing of value had been taken, but a classroom had been vandalized, with children's artwork torn from the walls and a teacher's desk ransacked. The classroom had belonged to Elaine Harmon. The article mentioned that police had questioned several local teenagers, but made no arrests due to lack of evidence. What caught the investigators' attention, however, was a quote from the school's night custodian, who had discovered the vandalism. Whoever did this had a key. There was no forced entry, and only certain doors were unlocked. They knew exactly where they were going. This detail triggered a re-examination of the Harmon family home in the original case photographs. In images of Elaine's bedroom dresser, clearly visible was a small ceramic dish containing several keys, presumably including her classroom key, which would have been accessible to anyone in the household. The vandalism, while apparently unrelated to the subsequent disappearance, suggested a pattern of escalating behavior. If Michael had been responsible, perhaps acting out his resentment toward his mother's focus on school and, by extension, her students instead of him, it represented a significant escalation from previous incidents. It also hinted at a willingness to violate boundaries and use deception to express his anger. As these pieces began to align, forming the outline of a narrative far more complex than originally imagined, Michael Harmon's condition suddenly changed. After 4 days in a coma, he regained consciousness. The medical team cautioned that he was still weak and disoriented, but when Detective Emerson entered his hospital room, she found him alert, his gaze clear and unflinching. He seemed almost relieved to see her. "I know why you are here," he said, his voice raspy from the intubation tube that had been removed hours earlier. "You have figured it out, haven't you?" "Not everything," Emerson replied, activating the recording device in her pocket, "but enough to know you have been carrying something terrible for a very long time." Michael was silent for several moments, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but distant, as if he were describing events that had happened to someone else. "I didn't mean for them to die," he began. "That was never the plan." What followed was a confession that would rewrite the narrative of the Harmon case, revealing a tragedy born not from a predator's calculated malice, but from a child's wounded psyche. and the catastrophic intervention of an adult who should have known better. According to Michael, his resentment toward his siblings had been building throughout his childhood. As the oldest, he had initially enjoyed his parents' undivided attention. The arrival of Rebecca, and later Timothy, had changed the family dynamic in ways he struggled to accept. By the summer of 1980, at 12 years old, he felt increasingly marginalized and overlooked. Mom and Dad were always busy with Becky's dance lessons or Timmy's Little League, he explained. When I had a band concert or a good report card, it was just expected, not special. But everything they did was a big deal. His relationship with Vernon Blackwell had begun innocuously. Working Saturdays at the mine's garage, Michael had impressed Blackwell with his mechanical aptitude. The older man had taken an interest in him, offering to teach him about cars, praising abilities that went unrecognized at home. For a boy starved for attention and validation, these interactions were intoxicating. Vernon made me feel important, Michael said. He'd tell me I was smart, that I could have a future in his business someday. When I talked about how unfair things were at home, he actually listened. Not like my parents, who always told me I was being selfish and needed to grow up. Over time, their conversations had darkened. Blackwell, revealing glimpses of his own troubled past, suggested that sometimes people needed to learn lessons about taking others for granted. He normalized Michael's jealousy, encouraged his sense of victimhood, and gradually introduced the idea that his siblings deserved to be scared, not hurt, just frightened enough to change the family's dynamics. The plan had been simple. On August 17, while their mother was distracted with lesson planning, and their father was at the mine, Michael would lure Rebecca and Timothy into their mother's car, drive them to a predetermined location where Blackwell was waiting, and leave them there for a few hours. Blackwell would keep them safe but scared, then discover them and return them home, becoming a hero in the community. The children would be shaken but unharmed. The parents would realize how precious their children were. All their children, including Michael, and family life would improve, with Michael finally receiving the attention he craved. It was manipulative and cruel, but in the mind of a 12-year-old boy guided by a disturbed adult, it had seemed like a solution. The events of August 17 had unfolded according to plan at first. Michael had indeed left his friend David's house briefly, returning home when he knew his mother would be absorbed in her work. He had convinced Rebecca and Timothy to come with him, telling them their father had returned early and was waiting for them at the fishing pond with a surprise. They had willingly climbed into their mother's station wagon, excited by the adventure and trusting their older brother completely. Michael had driven the car he'd been driving on back roads under his father's supervision since he was 10 to the agreed meeting place, an abandoned hunting cabin on the outskirts of town where Blackwell was waiting. But when they arrived, the plan had immediately gone awry. Becky started asking questions when she saw Vernon instead of Dad. Michael recounted, his voice faltering for the first time. She knew something was wrong, and Timmy, he got scared and started crying for Mom. Vernon tried to calm them down, but they just got more upset. The situation had escalated rapidly. Timothy, panicking, had bitten Blackwell's arm when the man tried to restrain him. Rebecca had attempted to run, heading for the door with her brother's hand clutched in hers, and Blackwell, injured and enraged, had grabbed a metal flashlight from a shelf and struck Rebecca from behind. She had fallen instantly, blood pooling beneath her head. When Timothy screamed, Blackwell had struck him too, silencing him with a single blow. It happened so fast, Michael said, tears streaming down his face now. 1 minute they were trying to leave, and the next they were just lying there, not moving. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one was supposed to get hurt. Blackwell, realizing what he had done, had turned to Michael with cold calculation. They were both involved now. If Michael told anyone, Blackwell would claim the boy had planned everything, had driven his siblings to the cabin himself, had lost control when they tried to leave. Who would believe a child with a documented history of psychiatric issues over a respected business owner? They would say Michael had been jealous, had wanted his siblings gone, had acted on the dark impulses noted in his medical records. "He told me no one would ever understand," Michael said, "that my parents would hate me forever, that I'd spend the rest of my life in a psychiatric hospital or worse. I was 12 years old and terrified. I believed him." Together, they had concealed the bodies in Blackwell's van, hidden beneath tarpaulins and tools. Michael had driven his mother's car back to the neighborhood, but parked it on the street rather than in the driveway, a mistake born of shock and haste. Then he had returned to David's house, forcing himself to act normal, to play video games as if nothing had happened, while his insides felt hollowed out by horror. As the search for Rebecca and Timothy mobilized, as his parents' grief engulfed the household, as the FBI questioned and polygraphed and investigated, Michael had maintained his silence, trapped by Blackwell's threats and his own paralyzing guilt. The trauma had shaped every aspect of his subsequent life: his isolation from his parents, his move across the country, his decision never to have children of his own. "I have lived with this every day for 44 years, he said, his voice barely audible now. "Every birthday they didn't have, every Christmas, every milestone. I see their faces every night when I close my eyes. Becky trying so hard to protect Timmy, Timmy reaching for her hand as they tried to run. I hear their voices calling for Mom and Dad." When asked why he had contacted Diane Blackwell after his initial interview with Detective Emerson, Michael explained that he had been trying to determine whether Vernon had ever confessed to his daughter or left evidence that might reveal the truth. The newspaper clipping found in his hotel room had been part of his own private investigation, an attempt to confirm the location of Blackwell's former shop after so many years. "When I heard they'd found the trunk there, I knew it was over," he said. "I couldn't run anymore, couldn't hide from what happened, couldn't pretend I wasn't part of it." His suicide attempt had been born not just from fear of exposure, but from a deeper reckoning, a final confrontation with the guilt he had carried since childhood. "I didn't kill them," he said, meeting Detective Emerson's gaze directly. "But I might as well have. I brought them to that cabin. I betrayed their trust. Everything that happened after all the pain, all the grief, all the years of not knowing, that's on me too." The confession, corroborated by the physical evidence and Blackwell's journal entries, provided the framework for understanding what had truly happened to Rebecca and Timothy Harmon. The case that had haunted Millfield for nearly half a century was finally solved, though the resolution brought little comfort to a community still processing the shock of betrayal and the layered tragedies that had unfolded in their midst. Formal charges against Michael Harmon were complicated by several factors: his age at the time of the incident, 12 years old, the coercive relationship with Blackwell, the absence of homicidal intent, and the passage of 44 years. After extensive consultation with prosecutors, a decision was reached. Michael would be charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice, with a recommendation for leniency given the extraordinary circumstances and his eventual cooperation. The legal proceedings that followed attracted national attention, sparking debates about juvenile justice, psychological coercion, and the moral complexities of childhood trauma. Michael pleaded guilty to all charges, declining any attempt at defense. At his sentencing hearing, he made a single statement, addressing not the judge, but the courtroom filled with Millfield residents, including several who had participated in the search for his siblings decades earlier. "I have no right to ask for forgiveness," he said. "What I did and what I failed to do destroyed my family and wounded this community beyond healing. All I can say is that I'm sorry, not for myself, but for Rebecca and Timothy, who deserved so much more from their brother. They deserved protection. They deserved love. They deserved to live." The court sentenced Michael to 5 years of probation and mandated psychological treatment, acknowledging both his culpability and the complex victimization he had experienced at Blackwell's hands. He would never serve prison time, a decision that some in the community protested but others understood as a recognition of the prison he had already lived in for 44 years. In the aftermath of the case's resolution, Rebecca and Timothy Harmon were finally laid to rest in Millfield Cemetery, their graves placed beside those of their parents. The funeral, held on a crisp autumn day in 2024, was attended by hundreds of community members, many of whom had known the children only through news reports and the enduring legend of their disappearance. Michael Harmon was permitted to attend under supervision, standing apart from the crowd, a solitary figure whose presence was tolerated but not welcomed. The rusted trunk that had preserved the final secret of Rebecca and Timothy's fate was retained as evidence, its contents documented and catalogued with forensic precision. Among those contents, one item continued to haunt Detective Emerson long after the case was officially closed. A folded piece of notebook paper found beneath Timothy's remains, its blue lines faded but still visible beneath childish handwriting. It was a note, written by Rebecca, that had apparently been in her pocket when she died. "Dear Mom and Dad, Michael is taking us to see you at the pond. He says you have a surprise. Love, Becky, and Timmy too." The simple message, preserved for 44 years in darkness, captured the innocent trust that had been so catastrophically betrayed. It spoke of a moment when two children had happily followed their brother, unaware that their final journey had begun, a journey that would end beneath a concrete floor in a hidden cellar, their small bones keeping silent vigil until time and circumstance finally revealed their resting place. In the years following the resolution of the Harmon case, Millfield slowly reclaimed its identity from the shadow of tragedy that had defined it for so long. The auto repair shop was demolished, the site converted into a small memorial garden dedicated to all missing children. The Harmon house on Maple Street, which had passed through many owners since Elaine's death, was purchased by the town and transformed into a community center, offering counseling services and child safety programs. Michael Harmon, after completing his probation, disappeared from public view. Rumors occasionally surfaced that he had changed his name and moved abroad, that he had entered a monastery, that he had ended his life despite the failure of his earlier attempt. The truth, like so many aspects of the case, remained elusive. Detective Laura Emerson retired from the Millfield Police Department in 2027, her career defined by the resolution of a case that had begun before she was born. In her final interview with local media, she reflected on the enduring impact of the Harmon tragedy. "What happened to Rebecca and Timothy and to Michael reminds us that evil rarely arrives as a monster we can easily recognize," she said. "It comes in small decisions, in wounded hearts, in the vulnerable spaces between what we need and what we are given." The Harmons lost not 2 children but 3 on that day in 1980. The third simply kept walking and breathing, a ghost among the living. The rusted trunk was eventually transferred to the archives of the Ohio State Bureau of Criminal Investigation, where it joined thousands of other pieces of evidence from solved cases across the state. There, in climate-controlled darkness, it stands as a testament to a fundamental truth of criminal investigation, that no secret, however deeply buried, is truly safe from discovery, that time, persistence, and circumstance will eventually bring even the most carefully hidden truths to light. In Millfield Cemetery, the graves of Jack, Elaine, Rebecca, and Timothy Harmon form a small family circle beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree. Local custom has evolved over time, with residents occasionally leaving small tokens on the children's gravestones, tallish stones, tiny toy trucks, hair ribbons in fading pastels. These offerings speak to the community's enduring connection to a tragedy that shaped its collective memory and defined an era. But there is a 5th grave, separate from the others, on the cemetery's eastern edge. It belongs to Vernon Blackwell, whose role in the tragedy remained unknown until decades after his death. His headstone, once adorned with standard phrases of remembrance, has been gradually eroded by weather and deliberate defacement, the engraved words becoming illegible with time, a physical manifestation of a legacy being slowly erased from memory. In the end, The story of the Harmon children is not just a tale of crime and punishment, of secrets kept and eventually revealed. It is also a story about the ripple effects of trauma, how a single afternoon of violence shattered countless lives, how pain passes through generations and communities, how the quest for truth can both heal and wound anew. Rebecca and Timothy Harmon, forever frozen at ages 10 and 7, remain symbols of innocence lost. Their brother Michael, who lived his life as both perpetrator and victim, represents the complex gray areas that crime narratives often avoid, the uncomfortable spaces where human frailty collides with moral responsibility. And the rusted trunk that held their secret for 44 years stands as a reminder that buried truths do not disappear. They wait in silence. Their presence a constant, if unacknowledged, wait, until the moment when they can no longer be contained, until, at last, they speak.